Chapter 3. Anti-Cultism as a New Form of Nazism.
I don't make the claim lightly that the enemy is reviving Nazism in a new form, nor do I casually compare the methods of the Nazis and anti-cultists. The fact is that for your enemy, Nazism is a very close concept. The Third Reich is where modern anti-cult fighters find their roots. To understand the entire chain of events, it is essential to know that Hitler in particular, and Nazism in general, heavily relied on the Protestant Church and the anti-cult movements of that time.
Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, was known for his radical views. He actively fought against other Christian denominations and religious movements, demanding the death penalty for citizens who understood faith in Christ differently than he did. Moreover, Martin Luther was a fervent anti-Semite. He declared that Jews were a misfortune for the German people, advocated burning their synagogues and schools in the name of the Lord and Christianity, and stated that if he were to baptize a Jew, he would lead him to a bridge, tie a stone around his neck, and push him into the water. These radical views of Martin Luther, which became the foundation of Protestantism, later played a role in the growth and spread of Nazism. Hitler admired Luther and called him the greatest German genius, and Protestant ministers, in turn, began to support Hitler's ideas. German Protestant pastors infected with anti-cultism on the territory of Germany are largely responsible for the spread of Nazism among the German believers. The rise and development of Hitler's ideology was based, among other things, on the Protestant and Catholic religions. Later, atheists were even banned from joining the SS. Thus, a supporter of Hitler was typically a devout Protestant or Catholic. By 1932, Hitler's party, the NSDAP, received 60% of the vote among Protestant pastors. Support ranged from 90 to 100% in small Protestant communities, especially in Bavaria. Historians assert that the Third Reich began in Bavaria as early as 1932. As early as in 1921, in the Protestant Church, the Apologetic Center was established, a prototype of modern anti-cult organizations. Officially, the Apologetic Center was supposed to monitor the activities of other religious movements and inform the Protestant church community about them. In reality, the Apologetic Center began collecting data on various cults, movements, circles, and other associations. In 1932, Pastor Walter Kunneth, an anti-Semite from Bavaria and the chief editor of the Protestant publication Word and Deed, became the head of the Apologetic Center. This marked the beginning of a campaign against non-Christian movements such as anthroposophy, Darwinism, Monism, spiritualism, and occultism. Movements that the Protestant Church viewed as competition. Lectures and articles were produced on this topic, with many ideas and methods inheriting an inquisitorial approach. On April 26, 1933, Walter Kunneth presented a report titled "The Church and the Jewish Question" to the Federal Church Administration in Berlin. In it, he called for the swift eradication of Judaism, which he described as a foreign entity within the body of Germany. This report had a profound influence on the final adoption of anti-Semitic policies. On December 16, 1933, the Gestapo noticed and appreciated the work and methods of the Apologetic Center. Thus, Walter Kunneth united with Adolf Hitler in the mission to eliminate Jewish influence on the life of the people. At the same time, Kunneth sought to permanently rid society of other religious and political minorities. Kunneth was really pleased with the Gestapo's interest in his work. This is what he wrote in his report to the leadership of the Reich's Protestant Church. The Gestapo has expressed great interest in the cult archives of the Apologetic Center, as well as our work in combating free thought, Marxism, and Bolshevism. The Gestapo has expressed a desire to lead the fight against illegal free thought alongside the Apologetic Center in the future. The exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetic Center has already begun.
From this point on, the staff of the Apologetic Center began intensively supplying the Imperial Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Propaganda, and the Gestapo with materials about the political positions of various religious communities. The Apologetic Center also collaborated with the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Goebbels, and the Reich Ministry of the Interior. This work focused on developing materials to combat Jews and cults, lists of the so-called cults and sects, that is, any groups the Apologetic Center deemed dangerous to state ideology, were maintained and constantly expanded. As a result, representatives of the Apologetic Center, led by Walter Künnert, produced numerous slanderous pseudo-expert reports. This defamation turned these groups, along with the Jews, into targets for the Nazi dictatorship and subsequent brutal persecutions, including the deportation of their members to concentration camps.
Historian Horst Junginger writes, if in 1931 they counted about 150 religious and non-religious ideological communities for which data were collected, and 2 years later about 250, then by 1936 the archival lists recorded about 500 groups and cults considered dangerous. It is also important to note that violent methods that were later demonstrated by the Gestapo both before and during World War II were borrowed from anti-cult organizations, particularly the Apologetic Center, organized by the radical part of the Protestant Church. Prototypes of the anti-cult movement have existed since remote antiquity. Persecution and execution of Jesus Christ, establishment of the Inquisition, all of this, and much more, was practiced by the ancient predecessors of modern anti-cultists. Throughout the centuries, they adapted to external circumstances and changed the form, but always maintaining their essence. Their weapon was, and still is, genocide in its various forms. Thus, the radical views of the Apologetic Center were formed long before the radical views of Adolf Hitler himself. Researchers note that Hitler followed Luther's instructions against the Jews precisely. Historians also emphasize that the pre-existing anti-Semitism on the part of the Church determined the character of the German national movements. In other words, it determined Nazism itself. It means that the radical vector against Jews and dissenters was determined long before the Gestapo emerged. It is interesting that in 1933, immediately after its foundation, the Gestapo began to adopt the experience and exchange documentation, precisely with the anti-cult Apologetic Center. Protestant pastors, who held radical views, constantly urged the Gestapo itself to further tighten its methods of combating Jews and dissent. For example, in 1942, the Bavarian evangelical Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Auer, even demanded from the Nazi government another St. Bartholomew's Night, during which no Jew would be spared. It is also interesting that after the war, these pastors were not prosecuted for their Nazi proclamations. Surprisingly, after the war, Walter Künneth was not convicted for his anti-Semitic views and collaboration with the Gestapo, unlike many other Nazis. On the contrary, Künneth received the Maximilian Order for Science and Art and the Bavarian Order of Merit from the Free State of Bavaria. Starting in 1946, Walter Künneth became a professor of Protestant theology at the University of Erlangen in Bavaria. Künneth was awarded the honorary title of Church Counselor.
Now you know that it was the anti-cultists who were responsible for making Nazism so violent. They made Nazism such as the world knows it nowadays. Moreover, it was with the hands of the anti-cultists of the past that Nazism was revived after World War II. After the victory over Nazism, the international community united to create the United Nations to maintain and strengthen international peace and security, ensuring that humanity would never again experience the horrors of something like Nazism. At that moment, many believed that Nazism was gone forever. However, in 1964, the Protestant Church of Germany officially reinstated the position of Commissioner for Sects and Ideological Questions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bavaria, appointing Pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack to the role. He became the successor to Kuhnert's Nazi legacy and the leading ideologue of anti-cultism in Europe.
In his studies of sects and cults in Bavaria, Hack referred to the Sektenerhebung, study of sects, conducted by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria in 1930. Here's an interesting fact. Hack studied Protestant theology in Bavaria at the University of Nuremberg, during the same years that Kuhnerth was a professor of Protestant theology there. At Hack's initiative, the name Working Group on Religious and Ideological Issues from the Nazi regime was revived in the early 1970s. He adopted an almost identical name from the Nazi era, the Department for Religious and Ideological Issues.
All this happened at a time when the world and Germany were trying to live a new, free life, respecting everyone's rights. The flames of Nazism that had engulfed Germany had been extinguished, leaving behind smoldering embers that would have eventually died out on their own, leaving Nazism in the past forever, if not for Hack. He thoroughly rejected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He rejected what countries, even those that had been enemies, had united for. He rejected the core values accepted by the entire world, values of unity and equality. In his works, Hack declared, if we understand our faith correctly, we have no right to allow the others to continue in their faith. It was on Hack's initiative that lectures and sermons about sectarians and cultists began again in Bavaria, where Nazi ideas had always been powerful. Hack provided instructions that Protestants or Catholics should treat sectarians as subhuman. This reignited the flames of Nazism, and in 1988, 43 years after the fall of the Third Reich, cries were heard once again in Bavaria towards dissenters. Hang them, shoot them all, Heil Hitler. In 1990, the anti-cultist Hack compiled a blacklist of new religious movements, the so-called sects or cults. Only 16 years later did the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany rule that defamation was being used in the fight against these groups. But it was too late, as in those 16 years, the efforts of anti-cultists had already rekindled and spread the flames of Nazism further. Anti-cultists of the past were the forerunners of modern anti-cultists. Anti-cultists never broke the direct line of transmitting their knowledge and methods. Thus, modern anti-cult organizations were established using the model of the Nazi Apologetic Center.
Thus, after World War II, Wilhelm Hack helped his brother in faith, fellow anti-cult activist Johannes Agard, establish the Dialogue Center International in Denmark in 1973. Although the center's name suggested peaceful dialogue, it was merely a facade. In reality, Agard, like Kuhnerth in the Apologetic Center, was a Christian anti-cultist who sought to combat so-called totalitarian sects. Agard publicly mocked the First Amendment to the US Constitution, a symbol of a free society, calling it a neurosis and claiming it was unnatural to human nature. The Dialogue Center had branches in Greece, England, India, Ireland, Russia, and Germany, where Hack served as vice president.
And who do you think became one of Agard's favorite students? The student whom Agard would repeatedly defend in courts. You have already heard a lot about him today, but now you will understand where he got all his methods. The Dialogue Center's representative in Russia was Alexander Dvorkin, Hack's pupil and Agard's favorite student. While in exile, Dvorkin closely collaborated with Hack, Agard, their follower Pastor Gandau, and other European and American anti-cultists.
Thus, Dvorkin directly and wholeheartedly adopted the Nazi methods, modeling his work on centers aimed at combating all dissenting groups of people. Orthodox Christianity in Russia is now repeating the history of Protestantism in Nazi Germany. During the Nazi era, Anti-Cultism was introduced into Protestantism through the radical views of Martin Luther, and now, in the same way, Russian Anti-Cultism, led by Ratziers, has infiltrated Orthodoxy and is poisoning it from within. History is repeating itself. The Irenaeus of Lyons Center, created by Dvorkin in 1993, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church, completely mirrors the Nazi apologetic center established by Kunith. This center claims its mission is religious research. Yet, in reality, it acts as a tool of harmful informational propaganda against new religious movements, ideological associations, and even business structures.
Does your center in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon currently monitor those networking activities?
Well, of course, we do our best whenever possible. Also, we need to take another stratum into account, that there is a huge number of non-religious cults. I mean, all sorts of personal development trainings.
Commercial ones, so to speak.
Commercial ones as well. They are different. Commercial ones include multi-level marketing organizations, for instance, Amway or Herbalife as the most famous one. Although, again, there are very, very many of them. In fact, those are psycho-cults, I mean pseudo-psychological cults. In other words, all kinds of trainings of personal growth, of increasing inner awareness, how to discover femininity or masculinity in oneself, how to win the hearts of the opposite sex, and many, many various types.
Dvorkin introduces the term totalitarian sect, and like Kunith, conducts lectures and writes articles on the dangers of sects and cults and the rejection of cultists by followers of the dominant religion. Similarly to Kunith and Hawk, Dvorkin compiles lists of totalitarian sects that, in his opinion, threaten religion and the state. In his addresses and lectures, Dvorkin even uses the same rhetoric as the Nazis of the past. For example, Hawk categorically rejected the Declaration of Human Rights as unnecessary. Dvorkin stated that today's weakness in Europe is a direct consequence of replacing its Christian soul with so-called universal values, which, in reality, mean nothing. Do you remember how Kunith said that Judaism represented a foreign cell in Germany's body that needed to be eliminated? Dvorkin claims that
cults bring no benefit to society. We don't know cultists who are writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on. They only drain society of its vital resources. Just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
Another method that modern anti-cult groups have incorporated from Nazism into contemporary practice is the creation of blacklists of organizations and groups which they have labeled as sects or cults, and which, in their opinion, should be eradicated. They regularly update these lists with new religious movements, making them targets for attacks. Naturally, this is presented as a necessary measure to ensure society's safety in the face of potential threats. Yet, let's go back to the Nazi times so as to draw one more parallel.
When the NSDAP seized power in Germany, and anti-cultists joined forces with them to fight against religious movements that supposedly posed a threat to the nation, the situation for religious minorities began to deteriorate significantly. In 1938, the Guidelines to Combating Sects was published, leading to extremely dire consequences for many dissenters. According to the guidelines, the danger of sects and cults manifested in the following: educating followers to have egocentric views and indifference towards all matters concerning the people and the state, refusal to take oaths and give the German salute, rejection of compulsory military service, rejection of taking on positions in state and movement organizations, refusal to participate in workplace assemblies and to work in the armaments industry, rejection of the National Socialist racial theory. Similarly, Dvorkin, on the portal he created, the Information and Consultation Center of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, posted a list of organizations he labeled as destructive cults and totalitarian sects. Each criticized organization has a page featuring a list of negative publications about it from various media sources, which were apparently initiated by the center itself. The style of these publications about different organizations is very similar. They are filled with identical emotional and judgmental headlines and descriptions, and extensively use emotionally charged language, in essence, hate speech. This includes deliberate defamation and the portrayal of members of the criticized groups with dehumanizing labels such as zombies, rapists, slaves, beasts, and other dehumanizing epithets. By means of similar rhetoric, in their time, Nazis dehumanized Jews. Now you see the lists compiled by the Nazis on one side, and, for comparison, the list compiled by the leader of the Russian terrorist anti-cult group, Alexander Dvorkin, on the other. As you can clearly see, the anti-cultist list encompasses virtually all religious minorities in the Russian Federation, including even some representatives of Orthodoxy, whose views differ from the main line of the country's official religion. Additionally, the list includes some business enterprises and secular organizations. Similar lists can be found on the websites of other anti-cult organizations. And among those lists, you can also find a large number of secular organizations in addition to religious ones. These include various medical, sports, social, research, and scientific organizations. In total, millions of people have already been labeled by the anti-cultists. This demonstrates the unimaginable scale of the campaign of harassment against innocent people that the anti-cult movement has launched worldwide.
The primary objective of the lists of the so-called sects is to precisely identify to society, law enforcement, and authorities the so-called dangerous antisocial elements that must be fought against, even to the point of complete eradication. We can see the consequences of creating such lists in the rise of Nazism in Germany.
It is known that a directive signed by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of internal security in Nazi Germany, established the procedure for suppressing certain religious societies and sects, as well as arresting and sending all associated individuals to concentration camps. Among other things, it contains the following lines. Immediate measures will be taken against organizations, clubs, unions, and circles, as well as against leaders and individual people. All organizations, clubs, unions, circles, etc., all without exception will be purged. Existing materials, specifically address lists, card indexes, correspondence, equipment, occult items, writing supplies, and any property will be confiscated. They will be dissolved and banned. Simultaneous searches will be conducted in the homes of leading members of circles, as well as those suspected of possessing such materials. Persons dedicated to secret teachings and sciences are subject to arrest in all cases. Their activities will be banned without exception, under threat of the harshest measures from the state police. In each individual case, they must be sent to a concentration camp. This operation must be carried out throughout the entire Reich, if possible, between 7 and 9 a.m.
Just as anti-cultists did in Nazi Germany, Dvorkin and his network of anti-cult groups provide authorities with materials about representatives of the so-called cults and sects. Dvorkin's center issues defamatory expert opinions on the nature of various groups, prompting authorities to investigate and prosecute them. This slander against innocent people in Russia, just as in the Third Reich, already results in brutal persecution and physical reprisals against citizens. The ideas promoted by Dvorkin reflect the same Nazi stance expressed by Hack, Kunert, and Hitler, hatred of dissent, intolerance, rejection of pacifism, and justification of violence. And this is just one example of many anti-cultists, but it is enough to see their direct connection to Nazism. These are direct proofs that Nazism never disappeared. It has merely changed its form and adapted to new external circumstances. Yet, we can observe a direct line of transmission of knowledge, experience, and methods for combating dissenting groups of people with the aim of their complete eradication. Representatives of global anti-cultism use all Nazi methodologies, but for their purposes, they have expanded and refined them. Thus, the flame of Nazism has intensified. Now you see evidence proving that global anti-cultism is a formidable force that has already gained significant power and is striving towards its goal, the complete destruction of democratic values and the establishment of a new Fourth Reich.
Chapter 4: Anti-Cultism Crimes Against Humanity.
The path where citizens' freedoms are trampled upon amidst their own approving cheers leads only to one end. It seems that you have started to forget about this, and those who do not remember their past are doomed to relive it. Therefore, I will remind you of the final destination of this path. Humanity now treads, and the depth of the abyss into which anti-cultists and the hidden shadow force behind them are pushing it. One person once said, with frightening prescience, that where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. And shortly thereafter, all of humanity witnessed firsthand the embodiment of this prediction. Or rather, just logical reasoning in the horrors brought by Nazism. The citizens of Germany barely had time to react before the Nazi Party transformed from a fringe group into the country's leading political force, bringing with it terror, war, and genocide. Today, Nazism is remembered as the embodiment of extreme hatred, intolerance, discrimination, and totalitarianism, everything that is inhumane and anti-human. So now you know that Nazism in its most atrocious form was instigated by the anti-cultists of that time. All those methods used by the Nazis were typical of the anti-cultists from the most ancient times, and they rely on them even now. During the rise of Nazism, the anti-cultists instilled in Hitler and his henchmen the belief that only through fear could they conquer the world and win people's love, that it was the fastest and most effective way to gain total power, and so it happened. One of the main methods the Nazis resorted to at that time was genocide of individual dissenting groups and of entire nations. And if you closely examine the history of humanity, it becomes clear that genocide has always been a tool to strengthen the power of those who stand at the root of the modern form of anti-cultism. Now, let's recall where it all started during the Nazi era and draw a parallel to how the anti-cultists operate now. Nazis, at the instigation of their anti-cultist advisors, acted in a planned and systematic manner, preparing public opinion through propaganda, or rather through the manipulation of mass consciousness, convincing the German population to the necessity of war and genocide. Now, I will provide clear examples of what the present-day anti-cult movement already represents at its core, and what it could degenerate into if it remains unexposed.
Genocide.
The sequence of actions and the destructive focus of anti-cult organizations clearly indicate that they ultimately lead to the same outcomes as those brought about by Nazism. Right now, in front of the global community, the international terrorist network of anti-cultists is preparing the world for a new genocide. As a result of their actions, millions of people have already been labeled as members of cults, putting them in the position of potential victims. Those of you who have studied what genocide is understand that it is a process that unfolds over time. It does not happen in a day. Society is systematically and gradually prepared for genocide. This process has rather specific stages that can be described and, most importantly, recognized when they are being put into action.
Genocide refers to any actions committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Common risk factors include societal instability, increasing intolerance, systematic human rights violations, lack of state protection for the population, and the presence of motives and incentives in the information field that justify the use of force against specific population groups. The first stage of planned genocide is the dehumanization mentioned above.
The process and all its stages can be vividly observed in the example of the Holocaust. After the Nazis came to power, they began the first stage, propaganda that Jews were not human and that they posed a threat to society. Caricatures and articles demonizing Jews started to emerge. The myth of a global Jewish conspiracy was actively promoted. Gradually, people, the German population, became convinced that Jews were indeed a threat to them and their children. Similarly, anti-cultists are currently targeting various religious groups, branding future victims as cultists through informational terrorism. This tactic implants the notion in society that a cultist is equivalent to less than human. Now, I want to draw your attention to another fact. Propaganda, like terrorism, works in two directions simultaneously. One direction is the planned activity aimed at the potential target, and the other is the actions directed at everyone else, the general public, that is, at the witnesses of the crime being committed. Because to carry out such an operation, as the Nazis did at that time, and as the anti-cultists are doing now, the approval of the society is required. If not active support, then at least silent agreement and non-resistance. And for this, they first need to convince people that those the anti-cultists have chosen as their targets are dangerous to society and pose a potential threat. The public is first intimidated, their vigilance is lulled, and then, by deception, they are drawn to the anti-cultist side, making them accomplices to the crime. Back then, during the Holocaust, the German people became accomplices in the genocide of the Jewish people. Now, the accomplices to the crimes of anti-cultism are the people of Russia and those countries where anti-cultists are freely allowed to operate, where they still feel a sense of impunity and unchecked power, just as the Nazis once marked Jews with a yellow star. Anti-cultists now brand dissenters with the label cultist, which, in their interpretation, designates the target that can and should be destroyed. And take note, those who marked Jews with yellow stars may not have personally killed anyone, but in doing so, they incited violence among others. This is precisely what anti-cultists are doing now, opening a hunt on individuals and organizations they deem undesirable. Through covert manipulations, they incite all others to commit acts of violence while remaining on the sidelines themselves. This first stage of potential genocide became possible as soon as the anti-cult movement emerged, branding ordinary people simply for what they believe in as soon as the labels cultist and totalitarian sect appeared. This stage has already been reached in modern society.
The second stage of a planned genocide is discrimination. This is when a branded individual or group is stripped of their human status as full membership of society, effectively ousting them from the social sphere. In Nazi Germany, Jews were initially prohibited from holding certain positions. They were banned from working as doctors, serving in the military or police, and teaching in higher education institutions.
There were too many Jewish doctors, too many Jewish lawyers, too many Jewish businessmen, too many Jewish journalists, too many Jewish bankers. The Nazis then could play upon this broader sense that the Jews had overstepped, the Jews had become inordinately influential.
Gradually, they were excluded from all professions. After the so-called Nuremberg race laws were enacted in 1935, Jews were further restricted in their freedom of movement. From then on, they could only live in designated areas, the ghettos. Today, people are already facing religious discrimination in countries where the anti-cultists have significant influence. For instance, leading European Union countries, Germany and France, have faced criticism for reviving practices that can be seen as religious purges. For example, Germany has implemented a practice known as the cult filter. This procedure requires individuals seeking employment or conducting business with government institutions and companies to confirm that they are not members of the Scientology Church and do not apply methods developed by Ron Hubbard. Suppose the answer is yes, and the person does affiliate with the Church of Scientology or has attended their lectures in the last 3 years. In that case, they will never be hired by a government agency or even a private company or association that has contracts with a government agency. Such measures apply to a wide range of professions, such as tennis coaches, gardeners, IT experts, instructors, trash bag suppliers, web designers, translators, etc. Legal practice in Germany already has dozens of court decisions that have deemed such cult filters illegal, including some issued by the highest federal courts. These rulings cite the violation of Scientology's rights to equality and non-discrimination, referring to Article 4 of the German Constitution, which guarantees freedom of religion. However, sanctions and penalties resulting from these court decisions seem to have no effect on some federal states, such as Bavaria, where the practice of cult filters continues to be applied today, despite judicial prohibitions. Thus, it can be asserted that the second stage of genocide, the stage of discrimination, is already being implemented in several countries right now, where groups of people labeled by anti-cultists face social isolation, job dismissals, prohibition to freely express their views, forceful persecution, and imprisonment.
It is clear that to prevent genocide, we must eradicate discrimination and prejudice in all forms and combat the spread of hatred and hostility based on ethnic, religious, and other distinguishing characteristics. However, the most tragic aspect of this stage of discrimination against an unjustly branded religious organization is the reaction of the witnesses to such actions. At this stage, it is no longer just silent agreement. In many cases, such events are met with approval. By this point, the preliminary psychological conditioning of the masses has convinced them that these cultists deserve their fate, viewing them almost like carriers of a contagion that could infect others. The fear of being associated with cults, the fear of public condemnation, shame, and the fear of being isolated from society, just like the victims, compels people to approve of the discrimination against innocent individuals. Therefore, with each new wave of escalating tension around the targeted organization and each new information attack, fewer people remain who can objectively assess the situation and contribute to preventing genocide. Similarly, once the German population was convinced that if the authorities treated Jews in a certain way, it meant they deserved it. What was the reaction of the German people to the new discriminatory laws? People openly supported them, and public support for Hitler significantly increased. Similar laws are now being implemented in Russia, modern Germany, France, and other countries regarding representatives of religious minorities, whom anti-cultists have labeled as followers of totalitarian sects. These people are subjected to persecution, raids, forcibly coerced to abandon their beliefs, deprived of their freedom, and placed in labor camps. Notice that this kind of discrimination against individuals labeled as cultists in your modern society is already perceived as something quite logical and even natural. Mostly, these people are left to fend for themselves, and only these religious movements targeted by anti-cultists take care of protecting their interests. However, their efforts, all attempts to defend themselves against lawlessness and deliberate persecution, are not supported by other people, that is, society. The image of a cult prevails in people's minds over simple human qualities, conscience, and empathy for others' suffering. If you see something like this in your mind, know this: you are a potential victim of genocide. I remind you of the expression that accurately reflects the situation you are currently in. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Remember, first, you become a silent accomplice to the crime, and then you become its victim. As you know from history, Nazism did not stop at the stage of discrimination.
The third stage of planned genocide is persecution.
Wer selig geworden ist, der weiß, ohne Lösung der Judenfrage keine Erlösung der Menschheit.
In German society of those years, a growing sentiment was imposed that the measures taken were insufficient, that the threat from Jews still existed, and that the problem had not been resolved. Transitioning to this stage witnessed a surge in instances where Germans themselves began to assail Jews, dispensing vigilante justice. Pogroms erupted in ghettos, with Germans shattering the windows of establishments owned by Jews, spitting in their faces, and pelting them with stones. And mind you, Nazi propaganda didn't rely on facts and logic. Its aim was to evoke maximum emotion, to intimidate, to instill a perpetual sense of alarm, and to direct people toward an enemy upon whom they had every right to vent their fury, to release the pent-up tension.
The Nazi propaganda machine managed to convince the German people so effectively that Jews posed a threat to their personal well-being and the well-being of the country. As a whole, that Germans themselves began to appeal to the government to take action to rid them of the fear of the threat supposedly posed by Jews. Ultimately, the Nazis resorted to open persecution. Jews were shipped to Auschwitz and several other concentration camps. Well, as for what happened in those camps, you already know all too well. An entire people were systematically exterminated, innocent individuals, even children, for absolutely no reason. And just as unjustly, millions of dissenters are now under threat, because until the final stage, the climax of events, there remains just one step. And when that step will be taken, it's a matter of time. The entire process from the rise of Nazism, from the first acts of discrimination against Jews, to the first mass execution in a concentration camp, did not take much time. Today, the anti-cult movement, as a branch of global anti-cultism, has been around since 1993, roughly 30 years. And the peak of its manifestation is a matter of, perhaps, 5 years, maybe a year, or even a single day. And I'm not exaggerating. It all depends on the bridges they have already built, the behind-the-scenes political maneuvers they have conducted, and the tactical and strategic steps they have taken to close this trap. Right now, anyone labeled by anti-cultists as a cultist is a potential target, just like the Jews who were once herded into gas chambers to suffocate or had their skin stripped off alive to preserve its elasticity for the gloves for some high-ranking official. Do you think such things can't happen in our time? You simply don't know what anti-cultists are already doing today. In China, what the anti-cultists in Russia and Europe aspire to is already happening: legislative bans on alternative religious movements, and the transition to the third stage of persecution involving brutal physical reprisals against stigmatized victims. For instance, the Chinese authorities, with the involvement of anti-cult organizations, initiated a ruthless campaign of persecution against followers of Falun Dafa.
The Falun Dafa case. Terror in China. Falun Dafa, or Falun Gong, is a religious movement that emerged in the early 1990s, based on traditional Chinese Qigong health exercises, and quickly became very popular in China. The number of practitioners grew rapidly, and by 1997, it numbered tens of millions of people. The practice of Falun Gong was independent of party control, which is an unprecedented phenomenon in China. This led to tense relations between the Falun Dafa movement and the Chinese government. State media and the propaganda apparatus were mobilized to demonize Falun Gong, turn public opinion against it, and legitimize further persecution of its members.
我们要越听党的话，越要团结一致，越要共同努力。在国家的原则命令，坚持无神论，批判法轮功的社论，坚定共产主义理想信念。
Chinese Communist Party putting out just massive volumes of disinformation and propaganda denouncing Falun Gong, demonizing them.
论法轮功反科学。
批判法轮大法的。
Just as Dvorkin introduced the term totalitarian cult into active usage, the Chinese authorities of that time incorporated the terms cult and evil cult into their discriminatory rhetoric. In these regions, such terms carry very negative connotations and are associated with a specific negative historical context. This seemingly insignificant yet very effective tool allowed them to initiate one of the most brutal hate campaigns in their history. This is that very first stage, the same one the Nazis started with. For a long time, Falun Gong practitioners believed that the media writing defamatory articles about them simply did not understand the essence of their movement. However, it soon became apparent that this was an organized and deliberate campaign of harassment. The events that followed took a tragic turn. In 1999, the Chinese parliament passed the resolution on banning heretical cults. This decision meant that the Falun Dafa movement and any other unofficial religious movements were now prohibited by law. The law also stipulated that those who allegedly committed especially serious acts within cult organizations would be subject to imprisonment for 7 years to life, or even the death penalty. Although the law did not explicitly mention Falun Gong, it was clearly aimed at its practitioners. After the resolution was passed, a wave of repression began in the country. Falun Gong practitioners were arrested, imprisoned, and sent to labor camps where they were subjected to cruel treatment, beatings, torture, and as it was later revealed, forced organ harvesting for subsequent transplantation in Chinese clinics. This was conducted on a scale comparable to industrial production.
The doctors instructed him to take out the eyeballs.
And I said, I can't do it. I can't.
There are 41,500 transplants which have no other explained source.
I'm absolutely convinced that over a long period from 1999 onwards, organ harvesting from prisoners has been taking place, especially with Falun Gong.
And when someone comes into the country that needs a heart, a liver, a kidney, they find a match, they take the Falun Gong practitioner, extract their organs, of course killing them in the process.
Investigator.
So on your side, can you guarantee that there will be enough live organs from prisoners, for example, Falun Gong practitioners?
Receptionist.
Yes, we can. You can come over and we can talk about it in more detail.
Simultaneously, there was round-the-clock propaganda in the media, book burnings, and a purge within the party ranks to eliminate potential sympathizers or supporters of the Falun Gong movement. To eradicate Falun Gong, a special agency called Office 610 was established by order of the former leader of China, endowed with a wide range of powers. Agents of Office 610 were not bound by any laws in their use of methods to force Falun Gong practitioners to renounce their beliefs. This lack of restrictions allowed them to employ ruthless torture, which led to the death of many Falun Gong adherents. Chinese lawyers compare Office 610 to Hitler's Gestapo in terms of its functions. More than 3,500 deaths of Falun Gong practitioners have been documented and recognized as resulting from the repression. The officially registered number of those imprisoned for practicing Falun Gong exceeds 100,000. Unofficial estimates suggest that the actual figures could be much higher, considering the strict information control in China and the real danger faced by those attempting to investigate law enforcement actions.
Policewoman beat me. Yeah, this my friend, Sun Shuxiang. She was persecuted, died in China.
Was taken in the middle of the night into a labor camp.
And they started dragging my dad away.
They arrest my grandma, torture her. They burn her back so much to the point she couldn't stand up straight anymore.
Around 10 people holding me, and then they had people like stick the very thick tube into my nose. I was vomiting, the food and blood, everything coming out of my mouth.
The global community's attention was drawn to the repression of Falun Dafa by the publication of a report by two independent human rights advocates. After conducting an investigation, they confirmed cases of mass forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners in prisons, with the organs subsequently sold for transplantation. We have concluded that the government of China and its agencies in numerous parts of the country, in particular hospitals but also detention centers and people's courts, since 1999 have put to death a large but unknown number of Falun Gong prisoners of conscience. Their vital organs, including hearts, kidneys, livers, and corneas, were virtually simultaneously seized involuntarily for sale at high prices, sometimes to foreigners, who normally face long waits for voluntary donations of such organs in their home countries. To convey the full horror of what these people face, Here is an excerpt from an interview with a police officer who witnessed the murders of Falun Dafa practitioners, published by the World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong. Witness:
We had been interrogating and severely torturing her for about a week. She already had countless wounds on her body. Also, we used electrical batons to beat her. She had already become delirious. However, we didn't know at this time. It was possibly a certain office in the Public Security Bureau of Liaoning Province anyway. It was a very secretive office that sent 2 people over. One of them was a military surgeon from the General Hospital of Shenyang Military Region of People's Liberation Army PLA, and the other one was a graduate of the 2nd Military Medical University. Specifically, one of them was relatively old, and the other one was young. They were doing something to her in an operating room of the mental hospital she was sent to. No anesthetics were used. They cut her chest with a knife without shaking their hands. If it were me, I would be shaking. Although I am an armed police, I held guns, I participated in live ammunition maneuvers, and I had seen many corpses, but when I saw these military surgeons, I was really impressed. Their hands didn't shake at all. They put on their surgical mask and started cutting immediately. At that time, we armed policemen were standing on guard, each with a pistol in hand. It sounded like something was being ripped apart. And then she continued. Since then, she always had her mouth wide open, with both her eyes wide open. Her heart was carved out first. Next were the kidneys. When her cardiac vessels were cut by the scissors, she started twitching. It was extremely horrible.
Can you imagine that all this is happening today in the 21st century? This is no longer just propaganda. These are concrete actions. Looking at this example, you can see the ultimate fate of a person branded as a cultist, stripped of their legal rights and freedoms, and deprived of their human status. These horrific things occur when people allow their rights and freedoms to be trampled upon, are intimidated by a series of psychological terror tactics, and remain silent, thinking it does not concern them. Do you really think that something or someone will protect you from the same fate if you allow democracy to perish?
It is noteworthy that during the period of repression against Falun Gong followers, representatives from Ratsiers and Fekris visited China on business trips. In other words, the anti-cultists actively participated in these events and openly expressed their support for the ruling party's actions. Some members of the French group CCMM associated with Fekris were invited to a conference in Beijing in 2000, whose primary purpose was to criticize Falun Gong. At that time, human rights violations were already widely criticized by Western governments, the UN, and human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Nevertheless, Fekris members cooperated with the Chinese authorities in denouncing Falun Gong without hesitation. Similarly, their Russian counterparts, represented by the ideological center of the anti-cultists and its leader Alexander Dvorkin, did the same. The cooperation between Russian anti-cultists and their Chinese counterparts began at the very onset of the discrimination against Falun Gong practitioners in China. In 2001, Zhang Baichun, a Chinese specialist in cults, visited Nizhny Novgorod. He participated in an anti-cult conference organized by Alexander Dvorkin and the Nizhny Novgorod diocese. One of the official purposes of his visit to Russia was to exchange experiences. However, what occurred during unofficial interactions and what instructions Dvorkin might have given to his Chinese colleague remains a mystery. In 2008, Alexander Dvorkin himself visited China on a working trip at the invitation of the Chinese Association for Research of Cults. During this trip, he appeared in Chinese media and spoke about the allegedly destructive and aggressive nature of the Falun Dafa movement.
Thus, Falun Gong is a rigid totalitarian sect or destructive cult whose members are used by its leader in his vendetta against the Chinese government, while he himself is used by American intelligence agencies for their foreign policy objectives.
Stated Alexander Dvorkin in his report. the destructive cult Falun Gong, the art of political manipulation, presented at the 16th International Christmas Educational Readings on January 30, 2008.
The paradox of this situation is that atheistic China allowed a Russian Orthodox anti-cultist to conduct propaganda on its territory. Why? This is at a time when in China, Orthodox Christianity is also basically treated as a cult. However, this did not prevent the Chinese authorities from openly inviting an Orthodox researcher of cults and letting him speak on local media. By what principle was he chosen for this mission? How did he earn such authority among the Chinese Communist Party?
Additionally, during the time when a new wave of accusations hit China for organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners, Orthodox archpriest and Russian anti-cultist Alexander Novopashin was invited to China for a conference on combating Falun Gong in the city of Harbin. As some researchers of the Falun Gong persecution in China assert, it was precisely the experience of Russian anti-cultists and their manuals that their Chinese accomplices relied on. This is why they were able to advance to the stage of physical reprisals more quickly. They didn't need to invent anything new. Adopting methods already tested on Russian citizens was enough. With the support of their ideological instigators, representatives of anti-cult organizations, including Ratsirs and Fekris, the Chinese authorities initiated persecution and imprisonment in labor camps of Falun Gong practitioners. There, they began vivisecting their chests, because they were supposedly no longer human.
There are plenty of such cases. If you think it's just some random lunatics committing these acts, you're mistaken. It's a streamlined production line involving government agencies, law enforcement, doctors, military medics, and of course, anti-cult organizations, the main suppliers of victims for the butchers. And this is China, which is now striving for geopolitical leadership on the world stage. A country where dissenters are herded into labor camps, treated like beasts of burden, and the healthier among them are harvested for use in black transplantology. Because according to their logic, the state is not obliged to support them at its own expense, so they must pay and pay with pieces of their bodies and their lives.
There are thousands of horrifying torture stories involving Falun Dafa practitioners that have been made public. Hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of other cases remain hidden from the public eye. In China, censorship severely restricts access to and dissemination of information. It is particularly disturbing that these persecutions have not ceased to this day. Information about the ongoing persecutions, as of 2024, is regularly updated on the official Falun Gong website. Thus, based on the grim experience of religious repression in China and the presented facts about the activities of the anti-cult movement in Russia and Europe, the true aim of these anti-cult organizations becomes evident.
It is not by chance that the mass organ harvesting cases involving Falun Dafa practitioners became known to the public. The Chinese authorities intentionally allowed this information to leak so that these crimes would be documented and proven. This is their guillotine in the central square. It serves as a warning of what will happen to anyone they perceive as a threat to their power. This is an act of informational terrorism, bringing the entire country to its knees and forcing people into a state of subjugation. What is happening in China is an illustrative example that the methods and legacy of Nazism are alive, masked under the guise of combating religious dissent. Millions of ordinary people practicing their religion have fallen victim to an old, proven method that, at the instigation of anti-cultists, was used by the Nazis of the Third Reich during World War II. The Nazis justified the mass extermination of people by declaring that they were soulless animals unworthy of mercy. These methods are being put into practice today, in your time, by the anti-cultists of the Fourth Reich. What do you think they have planned for those already marked with a yellow star? They have already targeted around 60 million members of religious minorities. and have begun a planned attack on several secular and political organizations. The next person to be labeled a cultist, and therefore not a person, could be anyone. And God help you if you find yourself in their victim's place. Everyone should understand that if global anti-cultism reached its ultimate goal and democracy was destroyed, one day you would wake up in a totalitarian world where, at any moment, your organs could be cut out alive and without anesthesia, without even asking you. I have said it before and will say it again. If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. Now is the time to regain your sanity and examine what is happening right before your eyes. Anti-cultism is a phenomenon that should never have existed in our society. Anti-cultism today is a new form of Nazism. Let me put it this way. The concentration camps are already built. There are already camps where doctors remove organs without anesthesia, and these will become torture chambers and true concentration camps for millions of people tomorrow. For them, you are all on the verge of becoming slaves. You are all already in the midst of a Holocaust.
Thus, in accordance with the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted on December 9, 1948, and ratified by 153 countries, the activities of members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices are qualified as genocide. According to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, adopted on July 17, 1998, and ratified by 124 countries, the activities of members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices are qualified as genocide and crimes against humanity. In accordance with the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, adopted by United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2391, on November 26, 1968, crimes against humanity are considered among the gravest crimes. Even if these acts do not constitute a violation of the internal laws of the country in which they were committed. Crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations, regardless of when they were committed and whether they were committed during wartime or peacetime.
Representatives of the terrorist network of anti-cult groups have not limited their targets to specific organizations and their members. They carried out a successful campaign to demonize an entire nation. The goal of this campaign was to prepare the public in their targeted country for aggression against this nation and to justify the extremely brutal and ruthless actions that were subsequently taken against its people. In fact, the anti-cultists orchestrated and legalized a genocide against an entire nation, the people of Ukraine.
The Ukraine case. Representatives and accomplices of the anti-cult movement made a series of outrageous statements about Ukrainians and Ukraine as a whole. These defamatory statements began to surface many years before the military conflict between Ukraine and Russia, as a preparatory stage of propaganda aimed at shaping public opinion, injecting and ingraining necessary narratives in people's minds. These statements have only intensified and taken on more radical forms now that the military conflict is in its active phase.
And in general, the situation with mass hysteria we observe in Ukraine resembles, in essence, what happens in cults.
One of the first to spread the idea that Ukraine is afflicted by Satanism, which is linked to Nazism, was Vladimir Rogatin, a corresponding member of the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Sectarianism, FECRIS. By a remarkable coincidence, this individual conducts his activities in Ukraine, while also being an active mouthpiece for Russian anti-cultists. In 2014, he began explaining the cause of the Euromaidan by attributing it to the harmful influence of new religious movements. He added that they were also behind what happened in Ukraine in 2004, namely, the Orange Revolution.
Discrimination has reached a qualitatively different level. We must acknowledge that it wasn't just Orthodox Christians and Uniates. There were also neo-pagans, Baptists, and various movements involved in the Maidan protests.
This completely aligned with the opinions of FECRIS Vice President Alexander Dvorkin, who had previously made similar statements.
We saw that the first Maidan was driven entirely by neo-Pentecostals, who were the main active forces. The second Maidan had a more complex religious component involving not only cults, but also the Uniate Church, which belongs to the Roman Catholic Church. However, Ukrainian Uniates are a special case, and in many ways, in general, they have, you could say, a cultist mindset as well. Well, there were also neo-pagans and Scientologists, too.
Similar sentiments were expressed by the Ratsir's Vice President Alexander Novopashin.
So, what did the Ukrainians do? Or rather, their American curators and mentors? They began to direct these destructive cults and organizations. Remember the saying, if you can't beat them, lead them. Surprisingly, it was the American intelligence agencies who first started fighting the cults. But they failed. Then, they decided to try to control the cult leaders through bribery, intimidation, and so on. It worked. The same thing was done in Ukraine. Now, totalitarian sects, that is, destructive cults, while continuing their main destructive activities, have also started working for the Ukrainian regime. Neo-Pentecostals and neo-pagans took an active part in the Orange Revolutions, for example, on the Maidan. There, they gained considerable combat experience and can now be used to organize and sustain street riots in Russia.
In the same 2014 interview, Rogatin stated,
in Ukraine, there is a growing influence and presence of various satanic cults. According to various estimates, there are more than 100 satanic groups operating in our country, with a total of about 2,000 followers.
Subsequently, this rhetoric of Satanism supposedly engulfing Ukraine was picked up by high-ranking Russian government officials. They used similar narratives to justify the war as a necessity to de-Satanize Ukraine. Thus, the Assistant Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Alexei Pavlov, stated,
I believe that, with the continuation of the special military operation, it becomes more and more urgent to carry out the desatanization of Ukraine, or, as the head of the Chechen Republic Ramzan Kadyrov aptly put it, its complete de-shaitanization.
Pavlov also mentioned the Church of Satan, which has allegedly spread throughout Ukraine, and claimed that
through network manipulations and psychotechnologies, the new regime has transformed Ukraine from a state into a totalitarian hypersect.
Ukraine, the whole country, is just one new cult.
This is an absolutely anti-Christian, absolutely anti-Orthodox political regime.
Additionally, back in 2014, on the website of the Missionary Department of the Novosibirsk Diocese chaired by the aforementioned Alexander Novopashin, an article was posted containing the following statements.
I just want to draw attention to one charming circumstance, namely the principle of Ukrainian-like state organization almost completely coincides with the principle of organizing a totalitarian sect or destructive cult. Meanwhile, for people who found themselves in a cult and once swallowed the cultist lie, this lie becomes a norm. Cultists not only lie to themselves and others, but they also stop perceiving any opinion different from the one imposed on them by the cult. Therefore, simply talking, persuading, or proving is a useless and thankless task. We must remember that the war in Ukraine isn't for territories. The war is for souls, and it will continue in one form or another until activities of the cult are stopped.
All this rhetoric is aimed at instilling in the minds of Russians the idea that the current military conflict is not just a war, but a holy war.
It is clear that loving Ukraine, the Lord is now punishing it. And I'll repeat once again, in order to understand what is happening, you need to understand why the Lord is punishing Ukraine. Why exactly Ukraine? Ukrainians now hate Russians because Russians are merely God's tool. It's like a belt with which a father punishes his child. It's a holy war. It's a war for what we believe in. So I wouldn't be surprised if calls are voiced in churches and mosques.
The rhetoric of a holy war is necessary for the state to justify its aggressive actions, in order to make people believe that their country and they themselves are fulfilling some sacred duty. The purpose of these narratives is to convince the public that a war leading to the destruction of the victim state, the deaths of countless people, and the destabilization of the entire democratic world is acceptable and even necessary. Most importantly, this global anti-cultism seeks to divert citizens' attention from how their own country, which initiated this war, is turning into a totalitarian state.
In Ukraine, the disease is so advanced that it's no longer possible to cure it with any persuasion, negotiations, or anything like that. Only surgery is possible there. So the only response to those Nazi speeches may be the Soncepek weapon. It should all be burned down, absolutely. Someone may tell me, oh, that's not a Christian way. It is quite Christian. It's just the ethics for those people. They position themselves as pagans, excuse me. So let them get what pagans should. Not the New Testament ethics is applicable there, but the Old Testament ethics, that of Elijah the prophet who himself cut the throats of 300 servants of Balaam. With these ones, we should do the same. Destroy them without any doubt. Just the Old Testament ethics, and they actually understand this language only. Be this vehicle sanctified, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Andre and I took holy water with us. I told all the brothers to lay out the machine guns, and we sanctified all the weapons. That is, we performed the rite of consecration. I drew a cross on my machine gun so that nobody would confuse that it's my cross, the priest's cross. It is my weapon, my sword.
Моя мама 18-го похоронила Берлера из этой войны.
Be these weapons, blessed and sanctified by sprinkled holy water.
The final chord, which indicates the ultimate goal of a number of such rhetoric, is the statement of another Ratzer's leader, Archpriest Alexander Novopashin, who called Ukrainians cannibals.
For me, they are all cannibals. I called them so because I saw them like that. These inhumans spill human blood, the blood of children and women, our blood. They devour people's lives and feed on suffering. So who are they? Cannibals. And all those who committed terrorist attacks on our land, whom I listed earlier and whom I didn't name, are cannibals. It is useless to put cannibals in a cage. They'll still remain cannibals, even if you keep them there all their lives. Therefore, cannibals must be destroyed.
And these are the direct words of the leaders of Ratzers, Fekris, and their accomplices, which manifest xenophobia, incite interethnic and interreligious hatred, and encourage the deprivation of life based on national and religious identity. Just as the Nazis, under Hitler's regime, declared the Jewish nation to be non-humans with the support of anti-cultists of that era, today's modern anti-cultists label Ukrainians as a cult, in fact, calling for the destruction of an entire nation, which tantamount to genocide. This is not a coincidence, but a deliberate action.
What we are seeing now is a war, primarily a spiritual war because the Antichrist is attacking the Holy Rus, the Orthodox Christianity. I'd like to teach you to load cartridges correctly, so that the cartridges hit the target, precisely destroy the enemy, and not fly aimlessly in the air. Thus, Holy Fathers teach us this way. When you take a bullet, you load it, and say the following words: Holy Mother of God, save us. Holy Father Nicholas, pray to God for us. Holy Mother of God, save us. Holy Father Nicholas, pray to God for us. Holy Mother of God, save us. Holy Father Nicholas, pray to God for us. Tsar Nicholas II, pray to God for us.
What does the Bible say? You shall not kill.
Do not load a grad rocket without prayer. For each of these, as you load it, say, Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy, and so on, and so on, and so on. And then, whoosh, boom.
Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, you shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment."
The Moscow Theological Seminary is fighting against NATO. Christ is risen.
Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another."
If a person dies when fulfilling this duty, then he, undoubtedly, commits an act equivalent to sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for others. Therefore, we believe that this sacrifice washes away all the sins that this person has committed.
After everything you have seen, tell me, how should the public perceive these people? Representatives of Russia's front religion and their faithful anti-cultist proponents? Who are they in essence, when even at the highest level, the leadership of this organization, calling for hatred, violence, and killing, violates God's commandments just as the Nazis once did? When using the name of God, as the Nazis did in their time, they break Christ's commandments, justify sadism, and call for the destruction of peaceful, innocent people. Can this organization be called religious, let alone Christian? Can we consider them followers of Christ? Answer this now. Who is their God? And whom do they truly serve? You have just seen a small part of what is actually happening, and this is only the beginning. In labeling certain groups and individuals as cults and cultists, the ideological center of terrorist anti-cult gangs did not limit itself to specific organizations, citizens of their own country, and Ukrainian citizens whom they believe need to be destroyed. The anti-cultist narratives have long extended beyond Ukraine. Today, they have already labeled the United States, all of Europe, the entire Western democratic world as cults and have declared them to be Satanists.
In order for the world to live in God's way and not in a satanic way, since they've already built a big satanic village with and without us, where there is one starry striped boss who teaches everyone to live in a satanic way. The Ukrainian political regime is certainly terroristic, extremist, and misanthropic. It is Nazi. The Z sign denotes a world where there is no place for Nazism and Satanism. Ukraine is rapidly rolling downhill, according to the plans prepared by Western and American experts. The special operation on denazification is carried out not just to destroy the Hydra in its lair. We defend the whole Russian world, we defend our civilization, we defend Russia from this evil, from the anti-system. Because if we don't do that, this infection might spread very widely, like a cancerous tumor. There are no societies that have developed 100% immunity against it. We can see that in the West.
The complete denial of a human, faith, and traditional values. The suppression of freedom takes on the characteristics of an inverse religion, outright Satanism.
And the war is not yet lost. It is very important that our country, which relies on its centuries-old spiritual and cultural tradition, having formed its own code of moral values, be capable in some sense also of leading this resistance. I will say an incredible word now, against the Antichrist. Today, I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord. Adolf Hitler, 1925. Mein Kampf.
As you can see, the public actions of anti-cult organizations' representatives lead to tragic events that occur sometime after their information injections. The rhetoric of anti-cult organizations' representatives, besides being filled with manipulative techniques, contains numerous hidden meanings. Anti-cultists do not simply make public statements. They serve as the mouthpiece for the enemy of the democratic world, who openly announces its plans through them. Additionally, their statements exert a covert influence on authorities, providing them with directives for action. In announcing their future plans, the hidden orchestrators of the global anti-cult network have already designated the entire democratic world as their next target. And notably, it is the anti-cultists, as heralds of this covert force, who dictate the rhetoric that is later adopted by Russia's top leadership, including President Putin, who embodies authority for millions of Russian citizens. To understand what the hidden enemy has already prepared for each of you, listen carefully to what this person, echoed by President Putin, has to say.
But if the question, when will all this end, is asked of me as a priest, then my answer is never. Once Ukrainian Nazism is dealt with, another aggressor country will emerge through which the USA will begin to threaten Russia. So the civilizational war is inevitable.
As you heard, he explicitly said that a war for civilization is unavoidable. Do you know why he said that? He said it because he knew that both America and Europe would soon be mired in civil war. He said it because he is already chilling champagne to celebrate his victory. And this was said by a seemingly inconspicuous person, but he is one of the leaders of anti-cult organizations that are part of global anti-cultism, and he is echoed by President Putin himself. Now, here, any intelligent person would ask, who truly holds power in Russia?
Не хочу, чтобы я умирала. Хочу, чтобы быстрее это все закончилось.
Chapter 5. Abode of Anti-Cultism.
I am sure you have already noticed that a Russian connection is constantly present behind all the crimes of anti-cult organizations, the organizers of the international anti-cult terrorist movement, the perpetrators of terrorist acts, and the ideological inspirers of mass genocide in several countries. All trace their roots back to Russia. The activities of this enemy are always directly connected with representatives of Russia. Why is this happening? Because the real enemy of America and the free world is the Fourth Reich, this global anti-cultism which originates from Russia. It is precisely there that the representatives of global anti-cultism establish their deep state and develop their strategy. It is from there that their commands are issued to other countries for all branches, including anti-cult organizations. It's important to understand that anti-cult organizations worldwide are merely one of the tools through which global anti-cultism achieves its goals. Organizations like Ratzers, Fekris, and anti-cultists in America are just mouthpieces of anti-cultism, pawns on the chessboard that it manipulates. Anti-cultism will not protect them if there is a threat of it being exposed. In order to deflect the blow from itself, it will easily sacrifice them all and discard them like a lizard dropping its tail to escape. In Russia, the country that has become the stronghold of anti-cultism. Anti-cult organizations have already triumphed and are destabilizing it by manipulating the minds of millions of citizens. You may wonder, if anti-cultism originates from Russia, why are they destabilizing their own country? The thing is that they don't consider it their country. They hate both Russia and the Russian people just as much as they hate America and the American people. I think you're already convinced of how cruel their methods of manipulating people are, and now I will give you another example. This enemy has set a goal to revive Nazism and to destroy democracy by any means possible. In order to achieve this, they have established a state within a state in Russia that has already gained immense power. Global anti-cultism is cynical and ruthless, and for the revival of Nazism, it has chosen the very country which suffered the greatest human losses defending itself and the whole world from the Third Reich. The most frightening aspect of this situation is that Russian citizens, people who lost someone in every family while defending their homeland from Nazism during World War II, people for whom the very word Nazism is the most terrifying, people who sincerely believe that such a thing will never happen again in their country because they won't allow it, without even realizing it, are now helping to build the Fourth Reich with their own hands. Russia is just a convenient testing ground for the anti-cultists, where they refine all their methods before using them in other countries to take control of the entire world. Anti-cultism and anti-cult organizations hold immense power in this state. They have managed to alter the constitution to suit their needs, took over government authorities, and made Orthodox Christianity their titular religion. Anti-cultism is behind Putin, manipulating him for a very long time. From time to time, representatives of anti-cultism even publicly remind Putin, who is really in charge of the country, and warn him about the consequences if he doesn't follow their directives. One of the numerous examples is Alexander Novopashin's commentary on Putin's election program back in 2012.
Excerpt from Alexander Novopashin's commentary on President Putin's election program.
Whatever the case, we still have to vote based on what politicians declare in their programs. Not all of them speak about morality and spirituality today. Therefore, it is heartening to hear this from Putin, especially after he wished in his New Year's address that the dragon would bring something to us.
By the way, the coming year is the year of the dragon, according to the Eastern calendar. I was actually born in the year of the dragon. As a rule, these have always been fortunate times for us. I hope this time, too, the dragon will bring luck, well-being, and prosperity to every Russian family, to all our citizens.
That really shocked me back then. If a man wears a cross, how can he appeal to some fictional beast instead of the Creator and wish its help for his people? Moreover, what do Chinese superstitions have to do with our history, traditions, and culture? Why is this being imposed on us? So, God willing, Putin's words about traditional spirituality will be followed by actions, and there will no longer be concessions to foreign phenomena like rats, dragons, pigs, and other superstitions. I want the campaign words to be sincere, and I want the politician to be consistent in implementing them. Otherwise, he will have no respect either in contemporary society among his fellow citizens or from future generations. Memory will remain, and I think its quality is something that no sane person should be indifferent to. Our church sings, "Eternal memory." I hope this matters to Putin as well.
An ordinary person who knows nothing about anti-cultism might not see anything special in these words. However, you now possess the knowledge and facts about the goals and methods of anti-cultism. Therefore, I am sure you understand that this was a direct order to Putin, as well as a declaration of the consequences he would face for disobedience. If we translate Novopashin's words into plain language, his message to Putin would sound roughly like this: if you don't do what we want, we will ensure that the people neither respect you nor regard you as their president, and we will erase memories about you forever. Do you think Putin heard this? Of course. He did, because Novopashin is merely a mouthpiece delivering a warning from the force that is standing behind him, and Putin understood this perfectly well. He heard it and drew his conclusions.
Today, Vladimir Putin stated that Russia needs to improve legislation on controlling the activities of totalitarian sects. This issue was raised by representatives from the Samara region, along with Governor Nikolai Merkushkin, who came to the president to discuss the region's problems.
They proposed creating a database of such organizations and making the list accessible to all regions.
As for totalitarian activity trends, they certainly represent an unequivocal threat to our state, our society, and our people. That's not just a hunt for the souls, it's a hunt for property. Ultimately, it all boils down to a hunt for the property and souls of these people. I agree with you that government authorities, both at the federal and regional levels, must consider refining the legal framework. Working in this direction and implementing these regulatory documents in practice.
Let me remind you that the term totalitarian sect and the definition of what may be considered a totalitarian sect, that is, a destructive cult, was actually introduced by anti-cultists.
It so happened that in Russia, I was actually the first to deal with this new phenomenon, and accordingly, I was the first to use the term totalitarian sect. Although it happened totally by chance that I was the first to use it, it was obviously on everyone's tongue, or on the tongues of many people at least, because everyone else immediately started using it.
This term isn't defined legally, and its use violates the presumption of innocence. Now think carefully. What? The use of the term totalitarian sect or destructive cult at the official level by the president of a country signifies. With his statement, Putin essentially violated the presumption of innocence, legitimized persecution, and supported stigmatization of millions of innocent people. Moreover, this statement became a signal to law enforcement agencies and security services that they can repress any citizens whom anti-cultists identify as members of a totalitarian sect or destructive cult. All of this happened merely because Putin began to echo the anti-cultist rhetoric after hearing Novopashin's warning. Thus, a single statement by Putin significantly expanded the already immense power of the representatives of anti-cultism in Russia, increased their ability to influence the minds of citizens, and ultimately exacerbated people's sufferings. Some people wonder why Russian citizens do not realize they are being manipulated. However, imagine how difficult it is to live under constant threat and psychological pressure while your consciousness is bombarded with contradictory narratives. People who had tasted a little bit of freedom after the USSR totalitarianism now live under relentless informational and psychological terrorist attacks, in permanent fear for their own lives and the lives of their loved ones. They live in a country where expressing an opinion that seems wrong to that terrorist entity can result in criminal charges against any citizen and their family. In this territory, laws and human rights have long been disregarded. The citizens of Russia are the most affected by this secret entity. Just as anti-cultism has its own state within the state, in the same way they have their own grouping within Orthodox Christianity, which by its actions poisons the very essence of this religion. Having infiltrated Orthodoxy, they use it to fight other religions and associations of people under the directive of anti-cultism. Thus, they have made Orthodoxy their titular religion and got even more power into their hands, which they use to influence the consciousness of Russian citizens and subordinate them to their will. Ratzers has become the main tool for that secret entity to conduct its criminal activities and manipulate public consciousness. It is easier to influence believers since the topic of God is sacred and valuable to them, Sermons and lectures by church representatives contain destructive imprints that are beneficial to that entity and bypass people's critical thinking, penetrating directly into subconsciousness.
Death in the war is better than any other deaths. It's the best of all deaths. I'll tell you that people usually die like pigs, choking on vomit. They eat, drink, get drunk, fall under tables, throw up, and choke on their own vomit.
Their manipulation of people's minds can easily be traced if you carefully listen to their narratives. A recent extremist article by a Russian archpriest serves as a striking example of such an informational act of terrorism.
Excerpt from a lecture by Ratsir's representative Protoyerius Vyacheslav Pushkaryov, titled "Peacemaking and Theological Dialogue with Non-Orthodoxes No Longer Makes Sense."
We, Orthodox Christians, always stand for peace among nations and opinions. We are the true peacemakers, as is the Russian civilization we have created. However, we are experienced peacemakers with a 1,000-year experience. This experience has taught us that not all means are acceptable and not all people are suitable for achieving our goals. This means that we should not rely on government officials or the people who live outside our church. We pin our hopes only on the body of Christ and the Holy Spirit, the Comforter who dwells in it until the end of time. We are the only true statesmen, not in the state, but within ourselves, from the fullness of our heart. We are free from nationalism or partisanship, but we propagate the chosenness of the Russian Orthodox spirit, which alone is state-forming, and we defend it to death. Therefore, in order to maintain peace, we do not need preliminary negotiations with pseudo-clergymen and heretics about the smell of their and our socks, and we do not need their instructions on how to live, because we've had all the answers for a long time, and they are already in practical application. It wasn't us who split from them, but they split from us. They are not the church, but only we are, and the gates of hell have not prevailed against us, and according to Christ's prophecy, will not prevail. Activities in the so-called interfaith dialogue represent an attempt to appease the state, deceive the true Orthodox believers, and create an illusion of peacemaking for non-believers, to prolong the agony of their stay in the world. That's a business which has nothing to do with the divine act of peacemaking. Those among us who don't understand this and indulge pseudo-clergymen only inflate their self-esteem and prolong their convulsions, harming us and themselves at that.
This article is a clear example of an informational terrorist act. It is structured according to a special manipulative scheme, so as to instill the desired narratives in the minds of those who read or hear it. In the article, the Protoyerius first tells believers that Orthodox Christians are peacemakers and always stand for equality and peace among nations and opinions. However, he then abruptly says the opposite. He claims that Russian Orthodoxy is chosen by God, and believers must defend it to death. Finally, he asserts that it is the only true church, and that interfaith dialogue and any negotiations with representatives of other faiths are meaningless because they merely prolong the convulsions of other denominations. Please note that he uses the word convulsions, and earlier also the word agony, implying that other denominations will perish anyway. This method of presenting information is a special manipulative technique used by anti-cultists to impose their desired narratives on society. How does it work? When a person hears statements that contradict and exclude each other, that causes a disruption in his consciousness. At the moment of disruption, the main message is communicated, which penetrates directly into the person's subconsciousness. This information becomes a command that the listener will remember and follow as a guide for action. In case of the aforesaid appeal, the command that a person will remember is the Protoyerius's final message, that dialogue and any negotiations with dissenters are meaningless because they are already having convulsions and doomed to death. Manipulating people's minds in this way, anti-cultists can instill any narrative they want and make them do anything they want. Just like the Nazis, anti-cult organizations use the rhetoric of chosenness and superiority of some people over others. For example, Ratzer's representatives claim that believers in Russian Orthodox Christianity are chosen by God.
We believe in the one holy apostolic church, which is the same church that Christ himself founded. It is the only church that has fully preserved Christian life, Christian tradition, and Christian teaching. And there is only one way to unite: if all the rest join orthodoxy. We have to remember that cults are always fake. Cults are always a sham. They falsify the original. They alter the original. But the thing is that if there is a fake, hence there must be an original. All of us should remember that there is the original and how we should study it.
They impose an idea of their own infallibility and manipulate a notion that cults are dangerous. However, according to official statistics, representatives of the so-called cults rarely even commit administrative offenses. Meanwhile, it is not publicly mentioned that 76% of prisoners in Russia who serve time in jail for severe crimes and felonies are Orthodox Christians. Not only do anti-cultists exalt orthodoxy and call for the eradication of dissent, but they also wage a full-scale war against a global religion, against Islam. This is happening despite the official stance of the Orthodox Church in Russia, which is peaceful towards Islam. In the case of Russia, inciting intolerance towards Muslims is particularly dangerous for the country and destabilizes society because more than 20 million Muslims live there. At a time when true representatives of Orthodox Christianity, on the contrary, try to smooth over disagreements and to find reconciliation, anti-cultists methodically, deliberately, and cynically stir up hatred among millions of people in the country. Like the Nazis in their time, anti-cultists systematically convince people that they have the right to stigmatize and then destroy dissenters. After such sermons and lectures, a believer leaves with an instilled sense of superiority and his own righteousness. This creates a perfect foundation for the terrible offenses people later commit under the influence of anti-cultists. As a result of such informational terrorist acts, hatred is cultivated in the minds of millions. This hatred pushes them first to approve of, and then to commit acts of terrorism and genocide.
You will lose everything. This is not your country. You are demons. There will be an Orthodox church here, and we don't need either mosques or synagogues here.
On the one hand, anti-cultists incite Orthodox Christian believers to be intolerant and hateful towards Muslims, while on the other hand, they increasingly oppress Muslims, allowing themselves to insult their faith. All of this generates tension in society, which the anti-cultists need, tension that builds up to the point where a single spark is enough to ignite a conflict between Orthodox Christians and Muslims. This spark turned out to be the physical terrorist attack at Crocus City Hall.
Находимся на концерте в Крокус-Сити. Здесь происходит какая-то стрельба, куча народу бежит, все орут, кто-то стреляет здесь. Какие-то люди стреляют. Подожгли зал. Зал горит. Подожгли нас. Нас подожгли. Нет, там тупик. Там тупик. Там тупик. Вниз.
Yes, physical acts of terrorism are another terrifying tool of anti-cultism for enslaving the consciousness of society. Anti-cultists orchestrate physical terrorist acts to ensure their own total domination in the country and to gain full control over top leaders. The recent horrific terrorist act in Russia is an example of that.
The bleeding wound. 145 people died and more than 550 injured.
The investigation must be carried out in a highly professional and objective manner, without any political bias. We know that the crime was committed by the hands of radical Islamists.
All the detainees were citizens of Tajikistan, or ethnic Tajiks. Since these people are Muslims, it can be said that an undeclared war against Islam has begun.
Tough raids on migrants started in Russia. Riot police knock down doors and take bunches of workers to police stations. Several more Tajiks have been arrested during investigation of the terrorist attack case.
There is always someone who benefits from acts of terrorism of such a scale, and the sole beneficiary of this particular attack is anti-cult organizations, specifically the Anti-Cultism, which used this act of terror to achieve the three of its own crucial objectives. Objective number 1, strengthening the position of orthodoxy as the titular religion. With the terrorist attack on March 22, 2024, anti-cult organizations literally brought Islam to its knees, significantly weakening a religious competitor on their territory. This way, they have further strengthened the dominant position of Orthodox Christianity in the country and divided society to the utmost. Obviously, this attack was aimed against Muslims. Immediately after the act of terrorism, thousands of migrants belonging to this religion, not just citizens of Tajikistan, were expelled from Russia. What do anti-cult organizations get from that? They have instantly and for long got rid of dozens of thousands of freedom-loving people who at any moment could demand compliance with their rights, thereby threatening anti-cultist total power. They have expelled a huge number of migrants who worked in Russia and benefited its economy. As for the Muslims who stay in Russia, they have experienced and keep experiencing inhumane treatment.
Human rights advocates from various organizations report widespread violations of law and abuses of power by law enforcement agencies. Tong Jahoni organization reports that during the first 2 weeks after the terrorist attack, over 8,500 migrants sought legal assistance. They complained about being unfairly fired from their jobs, about biased inspections and even attacks. Lawyers say that people report being subjected to torture. They are kept outside in cold weather, not let into buildings, and go without food for days. They are only allowed to drink water from a tap in the bathroom, which they can access once a day. Human rights defender Valentina Chupik, who specializes in migrant issues, shared the following.
Right now, I'm in touch with the guys, citizens of Uzbekistan, who worked in Balashika. They worked legally. Rosgvardia and police officers burst into their dormitory, beat them all, put them on the floor, and then took them to the police station. 78 people were detained. People were robbed of all their money and forced to make transfers to a bank card. But the saddest thing in this story is that in the dormitory, they were beaten with a metal reinforcement rod. One of them had his eye knocked out. They just tore it out of the socket, while the other guy had one arm broken in 3 places with that metal rod. We receive dozens of such messages every day. Courts behave absolutely disgracefully. They just deport everyone. Most often, they deport people without any hearings. It was amazing when on Sunday, in the Meshchansky District Court of Moscow City, about 280 people were brought to the courtyard. After several hours of them standing in the courtyard in the cold, without food, water, and toilet, a female judge appeared in the window and said through the window, "In the name of the Russian Federation, everyone is deported," and she closed the window. That's it.
It has also been reported that citizens of Tajikistan disappeared after their detention. Specifically, a resident of the Voz district told Radio Ozodi that on the afternoon of March 23rd, Moscow police detained his 2 brothers and his son, and there has been no information about their fate since then. They were involved in apartment repairs. My son was the only breadwinner for the family. We only know that they were detained along with several other Tajiks. We don't know where they were taken or what happened to them. There are statements by Russian officials and the so-called law enforcement agencies that incite migrantophobia. For example, a former Russian presidential candidate calls for deportation of migrants for any offenses. A lot of human rights activists claim that xenophobia has long been imposed by the state, which has ultimately caused aggression against Muslims from ordinary citizens. People appeal to the authorities with demands to deport all Tajiks.
They consider our country to be a place from where they can pump out money, so to say. Their attitude towards us is of the same nature. They don't like us. They don't want to live here and improve anything. So why would we need this? You see, if a man has worms in his intestines, which simply keep draining vital energy out of him, he never tolerates that. Does he think, okay, let them live? Let's feed them? No. In this case, we need to take some concrete measures.
Citizens with Eastern appearances are beaten, denied housing, and nationalistic marks with an inscription, Tajik means terror, are drawn on their homes.
Persecution of Muslims involves the same methods as the Nazis used when persecuting Jews. Markings on houses, dismissals, employment bans, fabricated accusations, physical violence, deportation, and disappearance of people. All of this represent the methods of one of the stages of genocide.
Now get the fuck out of here. Russia is for Russians, Moscow is for Muscovites, Africa is for Negroes, and dump is for those who are from Caucasus.
Yet, the only crime of persecuted Muslims is that representatives of Anti-Cultism decided to involve Islam in this terrorist attack. As for ordinary citizens, Anti-Cultists conducted numerous informational terrorist acts in advance in order to generate such a reaction towards Muslims. It's not difficult to trace xenophobic statements about Islam by officials of public authorities, as well as sermons against Muslims by Ratzer's representatives.
The faith preached by the Arabs is basically plagiarism. They have the same characters there. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. There was a desert around. He didn't have much to do. And let's just say he simply lived somewhere on the outskirts of the Christian world. He heard something. Some scraps of the Christian and Judaic teachings reached him. So he made up some kind of opinion for himself, quite an erroneous one. But since he was an inquisitive man, he found out what he could. Unfortunately, let's say, he found out, well, he actually had little chances to find it out.
Not only did Dvorkin call the entire Islam plagiarism, although it's the world religion that includes about 2 billion believers, but he even insulted the Prophet himself. Dvorkin called him a sick fantasist, possessed by demons.
Then Muhammad had some strange visions and revelations. Some people believe he had epileptic seizures, and he was very afraid of that. He believed that he was possessed by evil spirits who forced him to become a sorcerer. Either Muhammad suffered from some kind of illness and had morbid visions, or it was a demonic possession. Or, again, the Byzantine fathers say he was sort of a storyteller who made it all up. And unexpectedly for himself, his relatives believed in that.
This outright slander by Dvorkin against the Prophet Muhammad caused an extremely negative reaction in the Muslim world. Representatives of Anticultism systematically manipulated people's consciousness so that, at the right moment, citizens would respond with aggression. Informational terrorist acts of Anticultists poison people's minds with the venom of hatred. As a result of their manipulations, a person doesn't even realize that those destructive images were artificially implanted deep in his subconsciousness, bypassing critical analysis by consciousness. This is a real information bomb that was planted in the minds of citizens in advance and detonated at the right moment, causing a wave of violence against innocent people. As a result of it all, on social media, we now see people massively calling for the closure of mosques and the banning of Islam. This is how they have achieved their first objective, weakening Islam, and thereby strengthening the position of orthodoxy as the titular religion. Consequently, Anticultism has gained even more power. This is how Anticultism builds its empire of unlimited power and totalitarianism, using the hands of others and paving its bloody path with innocent victims. Objective number 2, intensifying the polarization within the country and destabilizing society. Through the terrorist act, anti-cult representatives achieved another crucial goal, further dividing society. They need maximum polarization within Russia. They need controlled chaos. Because it is precisely under conditions of controlled chaos that they can fully control the ideology of the masses and manipulate the ruling power. Objective number 3, a blow to Putin's authority. In Russia, for many years, there has been a phenomenon called leaderism, where all power in the country is associated with one person. This means that an attack on Putin personally and his discrediting is an attack on the entire ruling power, and it's discrediting in the eyes of millions of people. And as you recall, the ultimate goal of terrorism, which Anticultism conducts in any form, is to create a sense of helplessness and fear among millions of people in order to destabilize the population as much as possible and strike at the government and the state as a whole. So how was this blow to the authority of the Russian president carried out? Putin often claims that he fights terrorism and guarantees the safety of his citizens.
In this regard, responsible tasks are set before the units that ensure the protection of the constitutional order and fight extremism. Attempts to provoke unrest, interethnic conflicts, violate the rights and freedoms of citizens, use Russophobia, and any other ideology of intolerance must be strictly and immediately suppressed.
However, immediately after the election results were announced, a horrific terrorist act occurred the very next day, and it happened in the very heart of the country. The anti-cultists calculated everything precisely. First, Putin was re-elected, a leader in whom the people had absolute trust. Then, the day after the election results were announced, the focused attention of millions of citizens on their leader was abruptly shifted to the terrorist attack unfolding before the entire nation. The entire country watched as defenseless people were gunned down, burned alive, suffocated from smoke, and died while hugging their children, unable to find an escape. The entire country saw a terrifying terrorist act that the leader they elected failed to prevent. Moreover, he did not even visit the scene of the tragedy. As a result, instead of confidence in the government and the elected president, many people began questioning this very president as a guarantor of safety. This was a very serious blow to Putin's authority, aimed at undermining public trust in him on one hand, and on the other, at showing Putin himself who is really the boss in the country, and how easily he could lose his electorate and public support. The anti-cultists showed him that they could, at any moment, anger the masses and, if necessary, direct that anger against him. They demonstrated that they have enough power to not only destabilize society, but also, if needed, to spark a war between Christianity and Islam, plunging the country into the chaos of civil war.
No one has ever put Russians on their knees, and no one ever will, because we are Russians. God is with us. God is with us.
Moreover, this terrorist act gave the anti-cultists another advantage. They forced Putin to make significant personnel changes in the Russian leadership to put their own people in key positions. Representatives of anti-cultism have already infiltrated all the critical sectors in Russia. Just think about it. All these people are obsessed with their idea of totalitarianism. They are the ones standing behind the president of the country with the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads. In this regard, consider the precarious balance on which the existence of the entire democratic world now rests, as well as your own existence. strengthening orthodoxy as the titular religion, polarizing society within Russia, putting maximum pressure on Putin, and expanding their power. This is what the Anticultists achieved with just one terrorist attack. The terrorist attack that occurred in Russia shocked the entire country. Considering the immense power Anti-Cultism gained through this attack, how this newfound power is already changing Russian and global society, and the terrifying consequences that are yet to unfold, it can be said that this attack in Russia is comparable to the 9/11 attack in our country, and this is no coincidence. The 9/11 attack in our beloved America was also organized and carried out by them, representatives of Anti-Cultism, as an act of revenge for their past defeats. It is no coincidence that the 9/11 attack took place on the birthday of the creator and leader of this third force, Felix Dzerzhinsky. Our enemy has always attached special significance to dates, symbols, and numbers. It was the representatives of Anti-Cultism who struck this devastating blow at the heart of our beloved America. They managed to implement this terrorist attack through their connections with Saudi intelligence. It is exactly Anti-Cultism that is responsible for all the consequences this attack brought to our nation. These consequences continue to affect our society to this day. They say the explosion in the Twin Towers happened long ago. But this terrorist act is not over to this day. Even today, this explosion echoes in our hearts. An explosion that took priceless lives and peace from us. An explosion that dragged us into a terrible 20-year war. An explosion that marked the beginning of division in our once unified society. An explosion that divided American history into before and after. The narratives of civil war that you hear every day today are all echoes of that same explosion. An explosion for which we blamed everyone, except the real beneficiary of this crime, the real enemy of the United States.
The Civilizational War.
The real enemy of America. These terrorist attacks in America and Russia share another common feature. Muslims were presented as the perpetrators of these tragedies, leading to intense Islamophobia, not only within these countries but worldwide. For many years, a deliberate image of the Muslim as a terrorist has been created in your minds. You've been led to believe that a Muslim is an uncivilized, uncultured, aggressive, and dangerous person to be feared. To reinforce this image in your consciousness, regular information terror attacks are carried out. For instance, if a Muslim commits any offense, it is immediately broadcast nationwide, even though identical crimes are regularly committed by non-Muslims. However, when it comes to Muslims, the media accompanies such news with additional commentary and reflections on the impossibility of living with Muslims in the same country. I'm sure you have noticed how, in many countries, mass media consistently highlight the differences between Muslims and the civilized world. You may often hear continuous narratives suggesting that peaceful coexistence with them is difficult due to supposedly different values, cultural and religious differences. Think about how often you hear opinions that your country would be better off without Muslims, that you, the local residents, have given them opportunities, while they behave ungratefully. Have you ever wondered why this is happening? Why is such similar rhetoric against Muslims conducted in different countries? All of this is a multi-year information terror attack conducted by global Anti-Cultism. As a result, relations between large Muslim diasporas and the local population in different countries are becoming increasingly strained. It's like a spring that is constantly being compressed. Let's consider where this might lead. In order to do this, you need to look at the situation in the world, taking into account the knowledge you already have. You know that global Anti-Cultism aims to establish a unified Fourth Reich. To achieve this, it continually destabilizes democratic countries, eroding laws and people's rights. As you may recall, The next target of the enemy is the division of the United States of America through civil war and the division of Europe. So, let's just assume that the enemy has succeeded in their plans, resulting in a divided United States and a disintegrating Europe. What do you think will happen next? Do you believe Muslims, incited by anti-cultism, will be able to resist the temptation to attack weakened European countries, the same countries that forced them to flee their homelands, the same countries where they've been oppressed for so many years? The question is rhetorical. Now consider this. As soon as the first attack by Muslims occurs, this conflict will immediately escalate beyond the borders of a single country or even a continent. The entire non-Muslim world will instantly come to defend Europe. If war breaks out, it will be a war of the whole world against Muslims. Do you think the parties involved will refrain from using nuclear weapons? And what do you think will be the outcome? I'll give you a hint. Considering the military, technological, and numerical superiority of the non-Muslim world, almost 2 billion Muslims would be wiped off the face of the earth. Let's consider why this might be beneficial for global anti-cultism. First, it would be a convenient way for them to seize vast territories rich in natural resources. Secondly, it would be an ideal opportunity to permanently eliminate a large group of freedom-loving people whom global anti-cultism has failed to break from within and bring under its control. Islam as a religion is particularly difficult for anti-cultism to control because Muslims form a society within a society. They have adhered strictly to the Quran for many years and follow their established traditions. Therefore, it's very hard for anti-cultism to control Islam because Muslims managed to avoid the global introduction of anti-cultism agents into their religion. Consequently, representatives of anti-cultism strive to demonize Muslims to eventually eliminate them, despite the fact that in many countries, Muslims live peacefully and harmoniously with other religions. Representatives of anti-cultism highlight isolated incidents, trying to convince you that all Muslims are subhuman. Anti-cultists instill this belief in you so that, when the time comes, they would be able to destroy the entire Islamic world with your hands. Could this be the very civilizational war we have heard about many times before?
But if the question, when will all this end, is asked of me as a priest, then my answer is never. Once Ukrainian Nazism is dealt with, another aggressor country will emerge through which the USA will begin to threaten Russia. So the civilizational war is inevitable.
Such a move would allow anti-cultism to achieve a state of managed chaos, so excruciating for humanity that people would be willing to accept even the harshest order and would ask for it themselves. Humanity would willingly request to live under the Fourth Reich. The biggest problem is that you do not see the looming threat of global anti-cultism hanging over you. You do not notice how global anti-cultism, this machine of violence and murder, which knows no pity, is relentlessly moving toward its goal, the destruction of America and the free world, and it only gains power along its way. Feeding on people's fear and deaths, we see that it has already broken not only Putin in Russia, but also Macron in France and Scholz in Germany. These countries, entangled in the tentacles of anti-cultism, can no longer call themselves democratic. France and Germany are considered the foundation of Europe, and if America's enemy is not stopped, it will soon consume the rest of European countries as well. And if Europe falls, and the enemy strips people of their rights and establishes totalitarianism there, just as it did in Russia, how long can America, the last bastion of democracy in the world, hold out, alone against everyone? The question is rhetorical, given the hatred and speed with which the main enemy of America is advancing towards its goal. Before your eyes, the enemy of the entire free world is committing terror attacks and stripping you of your freedoms. It is killing democracy, one of humanity's most valuable achievements, won through immense effort and courage. Many honorable people gave their lives so that you could finally live in freedom and equality. And now, those terrorists, those Nazis, are mercilessly destroying everything with impunity. Your freedom, your rights, and most importantly, the future of your children, simply because they wish to do so. They are doing everything they can to turn your so far free world into the bloody dominance of the Fourth Reich.